a lot of folks are taking the medium so much more seriously. It's not just like an add-on or a side project when it comes to business. They're using it as the primary driver for their go-to-market motion. And that means they're interviewing their customers. It means they're interviewing their partners. It means they're working directly with the C-suite, and they're addressing potential sales objections they're getting in the podcast format. So then their sales team is now enabled to actually go out and have real thought leadership out in the field.
It is time for Build That Podcast, where we will discuss how you can use a podcast to grow your business and expand your influence. I'm your host, Eric Rutherford. Let me encourage you to sign up for the 200 words to move you forward with marketing and podcasting, delivered right to your inbox each Tuesday. Sign up for it at buildthatpodcast.com/the 200. I'll also put it in the show notes. Now, let's jump into today's episode. I'm excited today because I have with me Trent Anderson. He is head of podcast publisher partnerships at PodChaser, which is the world's most comprehensive podcast database. They collect, they enrich, they distribute podcast insights to power discovery for listeners, podcasters, and brands. Trent, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here. And like I said in the pre-show meeting, it's great to put a face with a name after all of our back and forth over on LinkedIn. So excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. I was so glad to be able to connect, and just the content that you put out on LinkedIn is wonderful. And so for everybody listening, make sure you track him down on LinkedIn. So I really appreciated that. And yeah, just the camaraderie from that is wonderful. And before we get into PodChaser and PodChaser Pro, which are fascinating to me, so I'm excited. What is it about podcasting or that podcast medium that you really think moves businesses forward?
I think podcasts are so unique as a format because it's an actual dialogue as opposed to a monologue, and it's done in front of audiences that are intentionally tuning in to the show, right? And when you contrast that to basically every other way in which businesses try to communicate, broadly speaking, I kind of call it the megaphone effect, or shouting into the void, where a corporate blog post goes up, 3 people like it, nobody really clicks to it, and there's not a ton of intentionality behind it. Well, with podcasts, you have listeners that are taking time out of their day, literally clicking play. Yes, they might be doing some other things while they're actually listening to the show, but it's the intimacy of the ear. You're literally inside their head, whether they're using over-ear headphones or earbuds or what have you, but you're literally inside their head. And most organizations understand that concept of getting in front of audiences, but they think about it from talking at trade shows, doing speaking engagements, becoming a panelist in certain respects. But podcasts are everywhere, all the time, and so unique in terms of format. So I think it's a great opportunity for most businesses.
And that makes sense. And I think that is one of the beautiful and I think often underappreciated benefits to podcasting. It is this intimate conversation that you're really speaking to individuals within the marketplace. So let's kind of jump into PodChaser. So would you tell the audience, what is PodChaser and what problem does it solve? How does it do that?
Definitely. The podcast industry is very unique in that it's highly fragmented with relatively low NPS, or Net Promoter Score. What do I mean by that? Highly fragmented, you have 4 key players: Apple, Amazon, Spotify, and then Google/YouTube. And they're all trying to create their own walled gardens of data, insights, analytics, advertising features, and they don't really cooperate very well with each other, which is quite different than traditional media such as cable TV, broadcast TV, newspapers to a certain extent, radio for sure. So you've got all of these independent players out there, and there's no real standardization among any of them. So that creates a huge problem in terms of discoverability, because you have certain folks that have affinity towards different platforms. Maybe they're Spotify loyalists, maybe they're Apple Podcast loyalists, or maybe they're using third-party podcast player app. And for us to understand how successful relatively a show is or isn't, it's very difficult, because really the only thing you can do from a publicly facing endeavor would be to go into Apple and look at the charts. And that's great, but it's not really enhancing discoverability outside of top 100, top 200 types of shows. So our co-founders recognized that as a problem, and kind of the first iteration of PodChaser was really to effectively be the IMDb of podcasts. So if you're familiar with the Internet Movie Database, it's where consumers of movies and television went to find their next favorite show, potentially based on a favorite actor, a favorite genre, a favorite director, a favorite writer, producer, etc. That was really the first kind of foray into the space. So we were created initially to power discoverability for podcast consumers to find their next favorite show. From there, we added more features on top of that allowed businesses to understand the relative success, which we dubbed through listenership estimates, contact information, audience insights, and demographics. And then the most recent iteration is powering discovery for advertisers and those that are putting, sponsorship dollars, paid ads behind your favorite shows as well. So at the end of the day, the discoverability aspect is something we always like to promote because it's very difficult to discover your next favorite show.
It is. Yeah. Discoverability is like non-existent almost in the podcast sphere. And so I appreciate that. I love that example, that comparison to IMDb, because I've used it for years, found it very helpful. And so great comparison, and it very clear in my mind. So it sounds like as you have added on, as they have added tools, different data, different customers, different focuses, you're really kind of serving two groups. You have podcasters and you have businesses, and we can use businesses sort of collectively. How would you define the two? Because some businesses have podcasts, there's crossover. And why do you think of them as two separate markets?
So consumer facing site, which is just podchaser.com, which is totally free. You can access all 4.5 million shows that we have in our database, which eventually generates 1.7 billion data points. And that's really to understand what shows are out there. You can sort by category. You can sort much like the things that I said about iTunes or Apple Podcasts, but with expansion across all shows, right? So you can follow shows, you can follow creators, you can build lists of shows that you've listened to, you can share those lists with your social media followers, and it's all with the intent of increasing discoverability for each of the shows. As a podcaster, we've already discussed how difficult discoverability actually is. It's a great tool for helping your community find your show and really raising the overall publicity and awareness of the show. From the business aspect, now, of course, you have to start turning profit or generating revenue in some way, shape, or form. And the great thing about podcasts is there's a space for everyone. So from earned podcasts to owned podcasts, which you mentioned, as well as paid podcasts. So the tools that we offer for our business clients are going to help them tap into all three of those angles: earned, owned, and paid. Our first kind of tranche of paid customers on our subscription-based PodChaser Pro platform, we're typically agencies, and I'll bifurcate agencies into two separate kinds. One would be an ad buying agency or maybe even a media buying agency. And of course, they're more keenly focused on paid opportunities within the podcast space. Well, how they used to go about doing that is contact 18 different networks, try to assemble rate cards for all 18 different networks. All the networks have different modes and modalities of displaying their information, and almost typically always relied on a rate card. Well, that is great, but that's doing the same process 18 times over, right? So it created a lot of headache and a lot of strife in terms of understanding what the total addressable market looked like for, paid media budget. Now, on the earned side, we also had quite a few number of PR agencies that were leveraging our initial data swath because they wanted to find earned opportunities on behalf of their clients. And of course, when I say earned, I'm typically talking about guest placements, right? So a lot of their clients were saying, hey, this podcast thing seems to be growing. We're hearing from our customers that they're starting to listen to podcasts. How can we insert ourselves into some of these conversations that we know our customers are listening to? So that's where we have the agency side, both paid agencies, media buying agencies, as well as the more PR or content marketing types of agencies as well. And of course, business, which we'll loosely describe as folks that are concerned with revenue. That also includes networks and publishers. So these are the folks that are attracting and coordinating a number of shows underneath their umbrella. They're providing audience development support, monetization opportunities, et cetera. And they're really leveraging the data that we have in our database to help build competitive insights, strengthen the value proposition of their shows, and again, increase discoverability as well. So there's a great amount of opportunity for podcasters, and you can claim, if anyone's listening that has a podcast, you can actually claim your PodChaser profile, which I would liken to claiming your Google My Business page, right? And if you're familiar with doing that, it's an additional layer of credibility. It's an additional layer of being able to get folks who are trying to find you the right information at the right time. So yeah, it's a pretty robust version, and sometimes we even struggle with, hey, what should we be building for podcasters and what should we be building for our businesses?
Now that's fascinating. Just all of the facets that you have. Now you mentioned for people who have a podcast or businesses who have a podcast to go ahead and get their can you say that again, that PodChaser?
Yeah, you can claim your PodChaser page, and that's what we do. So in kind of defeating the four walled gardens in the Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Google/YouTube, what we're really doing is open sourcing information to all podcasters. And one of the ways that we're doing that is by allowing podcasters to claim their shows, but also provide proper contact information if they so choose, links to their social media channels. And again, all with the purpose of helping consumers at large find their next favorite show, at least from the podcaster side.
I love that. So if you have a podcast, if your business has a podcast, definitely encourage you to go there, set up your business page, and get into their database, into their search area. Because if you've been in podcasting for any time at all, you know how that's a revelation to be able to get into one and be able to use a database like that. Now, as you talked about those different facets of PodChaser, is that the distinction between what would be PodChaser and PodChaser Pro? One is the database, the other is more of the PR, more of the agency focus?
Agency and brands, yes, but that is how I would delineate the two, right? So the podchaser.com website, which is publicly facing, that's where you're going to get all of the kind of free stuff like I'm talking about in terms of discoverability. And then on the business side, we have one tab on each of the podcast pages on our website. And that one tab is called our Insights tab. And that is where you kind of pull back the curtain. You could get to see all of the great information, such as contact information, audience insights and demographics, brand sponsorship data if it's available, as well as a couple of other things as well. So again, whether you're doing earned opportunities, you want to spin up a thought leadership campaign where you're getting your CEO booked as a guest on relevant shows, they're speaking to your target audience, help evangelize your brand at scale. That's what you'd go in and do and say, hey, this audience looks like a great fit. Here's the contact information for the show. Here's the reach of the show. And that's how we're going to, go down the earned podcast opportunity endeavor as well.
That makes sense. Now, part of what you're sharing about just the agency, some of the PR aspects, and I've seen you write about just this idea also of guest placement, of having people to be interviewed on podcasts. And, obviously, just like we are today as a host, finding and interviewing a guest. I was wanting to look at really kind of both sides of that just with a question. So some businesses, they're like, I don't want the headache of creating a podcast. Like, I don't want to own it, but yet they see the value of podcasting. I guess the first question is, does appearing on other podcasts help them to expand their reach? And if so, how does that do that?
It does, first and foremost. And how? It's a great question. And we developed a 4-step process for helping our clients, both on the PodChaser Connect side, which is the agency that I run, as well as our other customers that are pure pro subscribers. And the 4-step process goes like this: content, context, audience, and reach. Content, we always recommend starting here because you want to find shows that are talking about topics that are relevant or germane to your perspectives or your expertise, right? If that's satisfied, then you move on to context. What kind of perspective do these shows have on said content? Now, if you are in the IT space and you find a show that's talking about IT, but your target market is a chief information security officer, well, you're probably not going to want to talk about shows that are discussing how to penetrate corporate security systems, right? So from a contextual standpoint, at face value might be a fit, but when you actually dive into the actual subject matter that they're discussing and the perspective on said subject matter, you would quickly eliminate that from your list of target shows to reach out to. The third part of it is audience. So again, because we have the audience insights and demographics, brand affinities, et cetera, you can actually use that as an additional layer to say, yes, we are reaching the right audience. We pull in information from the social graph, leveraging data from Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, as well as Twitter. And that's how we're able to kind of build out these personas or build out these insights as well. Now, the fourth part of this is reach. And reach, inevitably, when we start working with businesses, they say, hey, can you get me on the Joe Rogan show? And we say, sure, it doesn't quite work like that. And they'll say, hey, can you get me on NPR or the Daily, what have you? All great aspirational types of things to do. However, what that usually indicates to us is folks don't understand the actual podcast ecosystem. And again, there's 4.5 million podcasts in our database. And I like to describe this as a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, you typically have highly clinical, highly technical types of shows where hosts and guests are going very deep, very technical into relevant topics. I use healthcare as an example because we work with quite a few healthcare firms. We've got a gentleman we work with as a host. He's a triple board certified physician, 5-time dean of academics at major medical universities here in the States. He's also a healthcare CEO and entrepreneur. Incredible bona fides, incredible amount of information that he can discuss and with great depth and insight. But he only has about 1,000 listeners per month. Now, if I compare that to the other side of the spectrum, which I would consider more mass media, it's why would I want to only be in front of 1,000 listeners when I can be in front of 100,000 listeners? Well, the actual quality of the audience is going to differ quite a bit, right? You want to go super deep in terms of the subject matter. This is the side that you should be on. On the other side, the mass media side, we've got a show that we work with. This woman's a practicing registered nurse. She's also appeared on a number of the Bachelorette franchise shows. I've seen her on television because my wife and I watch quite a bit of reality TV. But in any case, she still talks about health, wellness, healthcare, etc. But she has much more broad-based appeal because she's effectively an influencer, right? So she's got over 100,000 monthly listens. And then in the middle, you've got a show that is hosted by a practicing cardiologist. She goes very deep in terms of the technical aspect, but she's also appeared on reality television. So she does have some more of that mass media appeal. If the doctor's on, about 1,000 listens per month and the nurse is on about 100,000 per month, someone in the middle, such as this cardiologist, would be somewhere between 20,000 to 50,000 monthly listens as well. So in dissecting the spectrum, there's a place for everyone, right? And if your goals or your initiatives are to get really deep on the technical side, you shouldn't be as concerned about the total volume of listenership. You should be worried about the depth of the actual content you're going to discuss. But if you have aspirations to do very broad-based mass media types of things, then you're going to want to skew further out on the mass media side as well. So again, just to back it up, content, context, audience, and reach. And then from reach, that's where we start to really look at the podcast spectrum. And that's the thing that, truthfully, I try to evangelize as much as possible because most folks just don't understand that. They know that they've got 120 channels on their cable television network, and that's what they get. Maybe they've got a YouTube subscription, and that opens up a lot more channels for them potentially. But podcasts are just very different than traditional media, certainly streaming media. And I think the more that I can bang this drum in terms of understanding the spectrum, the better off most folks would.
Well, I will definitely help you do that because I agree. I think we need, it is, Chris Anderson wrote, the book, The Long Tail, which was fascinating because I just recently reread it, and it came out like in 2006, right? That was before Spotify. That was before all of these other streaming services. And it's like predicting everything that we're seeing today. But one of the things he described was the ability to be able to search and filter down into that long tail. And it sounds like what you guys are doing, well, first, podcasts as a medium allow for that long tail niche area, but then it sounds like PodChaser makes it searchable, whereas it's not before. And so to me, that's a huge win. And if you're listening and, asking, hey, is a podcast right for me? Is it right for my business? Ooh, I feel like I'm not going to be 100,000 listeners. Just be encouraged. Like you don't need 100,000 listeners. It's all about your niche and your audience and how you can impact them, because you can have 1,000 listeners, 500 listeners, and still generate a lot of revenue and a lot of reach from your podcast. So I appreciate you breaking that out, Trent. Let me ask this: for podcasts, for businesses who have a podcast, what's the benefit with partnering with somebody like you guys to find guests for their show? Or do you do that? How does that work?
We've been doing more of that, but I will say the opposite or the inverse is actually more true. So we'll work with a brand that understands where their audience is. And how do they understand where their audience is? They do pretty detailed customer research where they're actually sitting down with a customer and saying, hey, what kind of content do you typically consume outside of your normal entertainment side or even entertainment? And inevitably they'll say, well, we listen to a podcast. Okay, which podcast do you listen to? When I'm trying to get oriented or up to date with news information, I listen to BBC. But when I'm trying to relax and unwind, I listen to true crime. When it comes to career development, professional development, I typically log into my Spotify app and I've got 2 different marketing shows that I like to listen to. And I always get some golden nugget out of those. And that's what I bring forward in my day job. And you start to say, okay, great. So it sounds like you and potentially people like you a predisposition to enjoying the podcast format. You want to do this a couple of times, as many as 100 if you can, but typically as long as you have like about 5 to 10 data points from actual customer interviews, that's going to be enough signal early on to give you the confidence to say we should experiment or we should try podcasts. Now, trying podcasts could take a couple of different forms, right? You can own a show such as yourself. You can go leverage other people's audiences through guest booking, like what we do quite a bit of, or you could enter into the paid podcast advertising game. Typically don't recommend folks jump in with both feet with the advertising side of it because it's very, very different than a Google or Facebook campaign. The guest appearance side is something we often find folks almost with like one toe in the water. Like we're podcast curious. We're not quite ready to commit to a full scale production. And as you know, everyone thinks it's easy to start a podcast because they buy their microphone off Amazon. They've got some sort of video feedback or on the computer and then headphones. And all of a sudden I'm a podcaster. Well, it doesn't quite work like that. So we typically recommend folks do 5 to 10 guest appearances before they feel really confident in the medium. And then if they want to turn that into an own channel, that's the way in which they should actually approach it. So we work with kind of 4 core verticals on the guest booking side: colleges and universities, typically with faculty members that are doing groundbreaking research, and we're helping them distribute their message at scale, which is a great way for them to gain publicity outside of just kind of the static peer review journal process, which can takes 6 months to 6 years to finally get submitted and get the information out. And it's usually rewarded with speaking in front of 20 of your peers in a dusty hotel room in Reno, Nevada, right? Not exactly a sexy endeavor for most professors versus podcasts where there are folks that have already generated audiences and built considerable followings, and they can, again, evangelize their research at scale. The second kind of core vertical we work with on the guesting side is with healthcare organizations. A lot of them have seen a great amount of public health discourse play out over the podcast medium over the last 2 years, thanks to the pandemic. They've taken a much more aggressive stance or proactive stance now after seeing really different podcasters kind of dominate the narrative around public health. I think probably everybody knows who we're talking about there. And then the third core vertical we work with are brands, right? And this might be the most germane to our conversation here. A lot of brands, VC-backed, PE-backed, or even SMBs, they have a certain problem in that if they're doing something very new or very innovative, or they're a category creator, they have great promise to change the world, right? But in order to change the world, they have to get people to actually buy into their message. And we call that kind of the crossing the chasm problem, if you're familiar with that framework. But we've got a client in the alternative food space that is growing fish in a lab and If you grow fish in a lab, you don't have to fish them out of the ocean. And if you don't have to fish them out of the ocean, then you're not going to disrupt the ocean. If you don't disrupt the ocean, that's going to make the ocean healthier, which is going to make the ocean more sustainable, which is going to hopefully reverse some of the effects of climate change. Well, that's all fine and well. And we believe in the mission and we support the mission. But in order for that to actually happen, people have to buy the lab-grown tuna fish, right? So one way in which you can help the public at large cross the chasm is by talking about very unique data, very unique founding stories, very unique insights that you have that kind of served as a catalyst for why the company even exists. And you can do that in a format that's not just, like I said before, a corporate blog post that gets pushed out, gets 3 likes from mom, sister, cousin, aunt, but you can actually engage in a conversation in a long form format. So 30 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever it is. And you can take the clips from those videos. If it was a video interview, you could take the audio and distribute that even further, even put paid media behind it to guarantee distribution. So that's one of the ways in which we work quite a bit with business clients. And the fourth kind of core vertical on the guest booking end is certainly with other media and news organizations. So working with podcasters to get in front of new audiences, tangential audiences, adjacent audiences to help, again, leverage other people's shows and unique followings, and hopefully bring some of those folks back and create more affinity there as well. So might have been more information than you thought you're going to get, but I think it's a really important contextual piece in terms of understanding how this all fits into the business landscape.
No, and I appreciate that. And it is, there are a lot of facets to it that, that I'm learning about, that I know people listening to this podcast, they're like, wow, I didn't realize, there were this many really lanes, different angles you could take. Let me just kind of back up and ask you, because the tuna example is fascinating, but just startups in general. Do you see, sort of in your experience and as you look at the marketplace, do you see startups, and I'm going to preface startups with, they could be like literally still in the garage or in the basement, so to speak, to, Series B investments, something like that. So, they could have $50, $70 million in revenue. So it's a spectrum. Mm-hmm. But do you see these types of businesses creating podcasts on their own in order to sort of become that leading voice? Is that something that is viable? I guess I'll throw that, if that makes sense.
It's definitely viable from a minimum viable product standpoint, right? I think we've seen quite a few startups say, hey, the industry, the market has changed considerably. The way that we used to go to market, whether it was Facebook ads, Google ads, SEO, et cetera, it's fundamentally changed since the COVID era, because you don't have people sitting around in conference rooms debating about which product they should buy next or what kind of service or offering that they're going to need. Instead, they're relying on digital communities, places like LinkedIn, Slack groups, Facebook groups, to get information from their peers. And the interesting thing about that is, how would you capture those types of folks if they are asking for recommendations for different sets, whether it's a tool or software or what have you? So one way in which I think the podcasts fit greatly into that is, again, by having these organic conversations with peers, and then the distribution thereafter. Like, that is really where the world is going. It's not like how we used to see when a company would raise a Series A and about 60 to 70% of the money was earmarked for direct response ads on Google and Facebook. That just doesn't really exist anymore. I personally can't tell you the last time I actually clicked on Google ad personally. And yet, for about 10 years of my career, that was the primary mode of advertising that we used and sold to clients and managed on behalf of clients. So it's a paradigm shift. And I think from a startup's perspective, if they can commit to the content game and they can understand how they're going to not just build a podcast, but then sustain a podcast, you got to be all in or you're all out. And I think that happy medium potentially is, again, dipping their toe into the water through the guesting side. And if they enjoy the format, they enjoy the banter, they enjoy, the kind of the net post haste, it's a good place to start. And then you can turn those guest appearances into leveraging traffic back to your own podcast. And I think that would primarily be the guidance that we give for many of them. That said, there's this great movement happening right now, especially in B2B, about building a media company. And I think that is probably like one of the smartest things that I have heard over the last 5-10 years. It's just really difficult. And in building a media company, you have to have buy-in from the top down and the bottom up that this is the route you're going to take when it comes to building out your go-to-market motion. I can't tell you how many CEOs I've worked with where, yeah, we want to do content. Yeah, we want to do thought leadership. Yeah, I'm going to write tweet threads and LinkedIn posts and all that. And when push comes to shove, they end up getting pulled into a board meeting. They end up having to put out fires with customer success, what have you. So unless like you are truly committed to building that as like your primary go-to-market, I wouldn't recommend testing the podcast medium. Instead, you got to be kind of all in or all out. But how does that compare with what your experience has been, Eric?
No, and that's kind of where I'm seeing it. And it's interesting that you brought up that media company idea, because I've been seeing that as well, is, to be owner of your content, to be able to distribute, to be able to repurpose. There's a lot of value in it, but you do have to have buy-in. It's not a bolt-on. It really is, you can gain some great efficiencies, but at the same time, you need to be committed to it. So yeah, I would totally agree to that in this space. That's I've got one question that came up, and I saw your post the other day, and so I wanted to ask that. You were at Podcast Movement this past weekend, and I saw your post. You were talking about different things you observed, and then one of the things was you said markets move, and right now winners are adjusting. I thought that was a beautiful hook. Like, okay, how are they adjusting? What did you see? And so that was my reply. So I wanted to ask that. So from what you saw at the conference, how do you see the podcast winners or people in the podcast space making adjustments right now?
Yeah, that means there's a lot of elimination of frills, to be perfectly honest. So instead of using 3 different analytics platforms, they might consolidate that down into one. Instead of using minimum guarantees to attract large podcasts to given networks, those are going out the window. There is a soberness about the industry that probably didn't exist 12 months ago, maybe even 6 months ago. And I think that's true across all businesses right now. People are being asked to do more with less. People are being asked to make a dollar stretch much further than they used to. And I think, again, the podcast medium is so great for this, especially for businesses, because like we're talking about, I'm very confident that this interview that you and I are doing right now is going to end up in at least a couple video forms, probably going to get a couple pull quotes from the interview as well that you can use for social media assets, et cetera. Well, contrast that to how marketing, quote unquote, has been done in B2B historically, where you're working on a 30-day content calendar and, Thursday's National Vanilla Ice Cream Day. We need to get a graphic up for that. What relevance does it have to your business? What relevance does it have to your audience? It doesn't. So I think, again, folks are being very intentional about the amount of energy and mind share they're putting into the podcast format specifically. And of course, Podcast Movement, the conference that I was at, it is inclusive of all kinds of podcasts, right? So you've got a lot of true crime shows, you've got entertainment shows, you've got branded B2B types of shows. They're all represented. And when I talk about winners making adjustments, it really is about eliminating the things that don't matter and getting very, very tight with perfecting the craft. And I also, in that same post, I said that talent is always going to beat tech. And I do believe that. And I think, again, because it's so simple to get a quote unquote podcast started up, like I said, microphone, headphones, computer monitor, you're good to go. There's a reason why they're called talent. And there's a reason why talent is the same kind of arbiter of success. I could take 1,000 shots a day at the free throw line, but I'd never be able to hit as many in a row as Steph Curry would. He's got more natural talent than I have, and he always will. So I could do 10,000 shots a day and I wouldn't even approach it. He just has some of that innate talent that's built into him. And again, I think if that's the most pessimistic view of it, the most optimistic view of it is a lot of folks are taking the medium so much more seriously. It's not just like an add-on or a side project when it comes to business. They're using it as the primary driver for their go-to-market motion. And that means they're interviewing their customers. It means they're interviewing their partners. It means they're working directly with the C-suite. and they're addressing potential sales objections they're getting in the podcast format. So then their sales team is now enabled to actually go out and have real thought leadership out in the field. So yeah, it's good to be in a sober space, I think, when it comes to business decision making, just because over the last 10 years, it's been anything but. So yeah, I think that's the bow I'd wrap on that post.
No, and I appreciate your elaboration on that, because I think we are at, I don't want to say at a crossroads, but we really are at a sort of this new step of where podcasts can take us. And I can really see the opportunities out there. And I think really, I say it's an untapped medium. You know, you talked about like 4.5 million podcasts out there, but yet I think we're just getting into the value, especially B2B, that you can provide with that podcast and with that method. So I love that, you know, you're seeing these companies saying, okay, we're going to use this as one of our core pillars and we're going to build from it. We're going to do sales enablement from it. And this is across the spectrum of businesses. These aren't even, you know, huge, well-known brands. These are niche healthcare companies, niche other types of startups. So if you're listening, this is really a great opportunity for you to get in and really develop a pillar for your go-to-market strategy. So yeah, I appreciate you elaborating on that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think another piece of advice, unsolicited advice, I might add, for business podcasters is, I said everybody needs to get lean. I said everybody needs to do more with less, right? Well, how do you actually show C-suite, CFO, executive level types of folks that the pod thing, whatever we want to call that, the podcast thing is working? And you have to install what Chris Walker at Refine Labs has dubbed self-reported attribution. And I'll do my best to channel my inner Chris, but self-reported attribution needs to be installed because there's no place in Google Analytics, HubSpot, Salesforce, etc., where referral source equals podcast. A referral source equals podcast guest appearance, right? I haven't seen it. Have you seen that, Eric, in terms of any analytics tools? It just doesn't exist. Right. So what ends up happening, especially in hard times, is folks typically default to what they already know. Let's throw more money into Google Ads. Let's hire more SDRs. Let's bring more salespeople in. I would really challenge businesses if they're tired of kind of running on that hamster wheel of we need more quote unquote leads. Well, again, another sobering fact with it is like 97% or 99% of buyers aren't in market, right? So how are you going to provide value, be helpful, enable them, give them a good experience if they're not interested in buying anything from you? Well, you can inform them, you can entertain them, you can infotain them, as some people like to say it. And I think that's the premise you have to enter into the podcast space with. And this is where self-report attribution comes in. In your contact forms, your high intent landing pages, which could be book a demo, get a walkthrough, talk to sales, you're going to have your same form that you typically use: name, email address, phone number, company, etc. But you're also going to have one field in the form where it's going to be, how did you hear about us? It's going to be open text, meaning people have to type it in, no drop downs, no radio buttons, nothing. And it's going to be required. Now, I hear from marketers and advertisers all day, every day that, oh, no one's ever going to fill that out. They're going to put in gobbledygook. And I'll say, okay, what does your current lead flow look like with your Google Ads campaigns, or if you're running Google Display Network? Almost all of the inquiries, and I've seen this, have something like, oh, job description, janitor, John Smith at gmail.com. Like, how many of those fake quote unquote leads do you have? And what kind of data is that actually providing? Well, it's not qualitative, it's quantitative. So when you open up Google Analytics, you'll see, oh, great, it looks like our Google AdWords campaigns are running great. What actually happens to those leads? And are they even leads? So again, the self-report attribution is going to give you a qualitative signal to indicate, yeah, if somebody heard us on a podcast, whether it's owned or earned or paid, and that was the most impactful part of them actually reaching out in an inquiry, that's good. That's positive signal. Now you can marry that data to your quantitative data in your analytics platforms to build a much more holistic picture. But that's really the first step. Like, you have to get this qualitative insight into it in order to even showcase to an executive team that this is even moving in the right direction. Once you do show those early indicators that something's moving in the right direction, then you get to operationalize, scale, and pour more gasoline onto the fire, so to speak. And Chris and his team at Refine Labs have developed a 5-step framework for this. It's called the R&D process. It's borrowed primarily from the commercialization process within the medical device and pharmaceutical space. But it's brilliant, and I would highly suggest if anybody's interested in doing that, going to Refine Labs and checking out their R&D process. But it all starts with the self-reported attribution angle, just because you're not going to get that information anywhere else.
And that is so important, the self-reported attribution. If you're not doing that, and like you say, you can just even starting by putting the where did you hear about us as a required field. Like you say, it won't hit everybody, but you will get some that you can absolutely connect. And if you're selling, well, anything, but especially, if you're a SaaS company, if you're a healthcare company, if your products are multi-$1,000s, it's really easy to suddenly say, wow, our podcast helped generate 50,000 in lead revenue or whatever that is. So yeah, I appreciate that. And we'll definitely put, could you say the company again?
Yeah, Refine Labs. And I think
Refined Labs.
Yeah, refinelabs.com. And Chris Walker is a great follow on LinkedIn as well. And I do recommend checking out some of his posts, because I think the most recent number I saw, they attribute about 60% of their revenue, and they're a $20 million company, but 60% of it comes from podcasts. So how do they know that? Self-reported attribution.
Wow.
Yet Google Analytics would say 80% of their revenue comes from direct traffic or search engine optimization. There's a fundamental disconnect with attribution. And another coin he phrased is the attribution mirage. And I would challenge folks that are listening to actually observe their data and say, how data driven are we? Even though that's one of their core messages that they tell investors or
I love that. We'll put all that in the show notes as well. I'm going to go check his LinkedIn out and check him out as well. As we wrap up here, Trent, if people want to know more about you, want to know more about your company, about podcasting in general, where would you like them to go?
Yeah, LinkedIn's the best place. Trent Anderson. If you just search Trent Anderson, PodChaser, you should be able to find me pretty easily. But yeah, I like to publish at least once a day on the platform. And typically I'm publishing information that I'm seeing firsthand. And some of it might be agreeable, some of it might not be. But at the very least, I think you'll walk away a little bit more informed about the podcast industry.
I love it. So make sure to check Trent out. All that information is going to be in the show notes. Trent, thank you so much. This was incredibly informative and fun. I just had a good time chatting.
Yeah, likewise, Eric. I appreciate you.
Make sure to sign up for the 200 at buildthatpodcast.com/the 200 and receive 200 words every Tuesday to move you forward with marketing and podcasting, delivered right to your inbox. Lastly, if you have questions or comments, you can find me on LinkedIn at Eric Rutherford, DM me on Twitter at rfordej, or email me at eric@straightforwardmg.com. Remember, use podcasts to grow your business and expand your influence.